probably, and this honestly goes all the way back to the original comments from many years ago. Um, the is the GM. How does the GM create these situations where to make the game interesting, to give people things to do. That's not just a bunch of rolling
Right.
and things like that. And I
Well,
think
really,
I
we
have
could pick.
ideas about that.
Yeah, well, cool. I'd like to hear them. We can compare. Might be kind of
Okay.
cool. Well, let's back up a little bit and see if we're on the same in the same frame of mind in the first place, which is that
Okay.
through dialogue, right, the very fact that we're listening to each other at all,
Right.
right, we're going to be generating fiction of some kind. And
Yes.
I mean that like the most boring definition of fiction possible. Just imagine stuff that goes. I don't care what other people call fiction. Um,
Right.
so if we say, okay, we're sitting around and we're talking, and it's not going to be fiction that goes unless we're listening to each other talk.
Right.
Um, I guess one way of looking at it is that anytime people try to story conference, like they're going to quote write a story together,
Yeah.
and they're going to do it basically by spitballing their way through it from point A to point B,
Right.
it's crap.
Right.
That we it doesn't work.
No, it really doesn't.
Yeah. So somehow we're doing something else.
Right.
Right. So that's if we can kind of start with that idea, then the next point I'd make, at least what we hashed out over the period of time that we talked about this, was that the term the game master is clearly a historical artifact, just like referee or
Yeah.
guide or God help us all, storyteller, whatever it
Right.
is that people are going to call this. But these are legacy label terms, and none of them really quite capture what on earth is happening. And
Yes.
what I finally kind of decided for myself is that we aren't talking about a personal role after all. We're talking
Okay.
about a wide variety of tasks,
Yeah.
and that those tasks are actually not necessarily tied to one another.
Okay.
There's a bunch
Okay.
of tasks. I mean, just to name a few of them, saying, closing on a particular situation and picking up with a little bit of lapse in time and space,
Right.
just
Yeah.
which we do all the time. I mean, we don't have rules for it in a lot of role playing games because you can't make fiction without it.
True. That is
So,
true.
so people just do it. And so the notion is that that's a task. Another task would be working through specific sorts of interpretations. I mean, role playing texts are this long standing, confusing, try it, make it up, see how it works kind of process. I mean, it's a small a art form in practical development through all these years. So
Right.
when you're sitting at the table and you got this book, you've got to cope and kind of sort of do a little game design yourself,
Yes.
right, as you're
Right.
going along to make it happen. In a lot of cases, the majority,
That's
anyway.
true. That's
So
true.
so that's another task, and that's not the same task as closing and opening scenes,
Right.
right? I mean, and
No,
there's
for
and I
sure.
could just keep going. I mean, there's dozens of these
Yeah.
tasks,
Right.
and I have learned that from table to table, and then if you want to get all rulesy and texty on us, from text to text, presuming that play sort of resembles the text to some degree in these different cases, um, you're going to find that the parsing of those tasks into a given person isn't the same from thing to thing, from time to time, from table to table, from game to game. And even though you might say that each time you have a game master, the actual tasks being carried out by that person as opposed to being distributed around the table in some way
Right.
is going to be
Okay.
different from place to place. Sometimes
Yeah.
people don't even realize it. I've sat at many a table where they will swear up and down, over and over, that the game master states the outcomes of rolls. That's the person who nails it down, says what happens. When whenever whatever resolution is going on, that's their job. And I'm
Yeah.
watching the table and I see people chime in all the time
Yeah.
and authoritatively state how they hit the goblin when all they have to go on is a damage number.
Yes.
And
That's true.
everybody they don't even look at the game master and say, is that okay?
That's true.
Somebody at the table responds. Remember what I say about talking and listening? Somebody at the table responds by saying, yes. And we move on. And I'm
No,
kind of
that's
looking
true.
there and going, well, what was all that about the GM doing all the narrating? Because
Right.
you're not. Whereas then I'll be at another table and it's very clear that that is precisely how you do it. If you overstep that, everybody kind of looks at you. Wait. That's what are you doing? And you're like, oh,
Right. Yeah. Stay in
and
your lane.
yeah, exactly. And then if we go to the text, you'll see the same thing. Now texts are tricky about this in role playing because they often don't admit what they assume. You have to see it's kind of like in some place where they're talking about the rules rather than giving you the rules. They'll say
Right.
something like, "Well, of course, a player never does this." And you're kind
Yes.
of like, "Oh, really? Of course, is it?" What you
That's an
mean
assumption.
is this is the rule you prefer for the application of your game. That's what you
Right.
mean. And
Right.
so you have to kind of read the actual texts about the text inside the book often to kind of get a clue on how this person expects you to be reading these things.
Right.
But my point is that they're different. So when I say GM these days, I recognize that it is a very different animal, or rather the person is a very different animal from table to table, from game to game, and that all those tasks I was talking about have to be done. I mean, you have to have descriptions of what happened,
Right.
right? You
Yes, you
have
do.
to have this stuff. The question is, I mean, what about making up the setting?
Right. Who
Oh,
does that?
GM's job. Really? Always? Or secondarily, what about making up the situation we're in right now? Who killed the dude? It can't be the
Yeah.
butler. The butler's the guy who got killed. So who killed him? And sure enough, there are plenty of games where I would never play this game unless we knew the game master had made it up and already knew, because that's a flat requirement of the rest of the system that he or she did that
Yes.
thing. But there are other games where it's exactly the opposite, and they're fun too.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. There's all these things all have to be done.
Right.
When some of them get concentrated in a given person, then the legacy term for that, whatever the tasks are, is game master.
Yes.
I
Right.
mean, that's kind of how I'm seeing it.
Okay.
And so with that in mind, then I think your question is, well, what about making stuff up? I mean, where does situation come from?
Right. Exactly.
When we're
Exactly.
sitting in play, and I used to say that we get too excited about characters and setting. I don't think you have characters and setting except so you can have a situation.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
might be stated a little extremely because this is the nature of the characters is going to contribute to the situation, obviously, right? I mean, so
Sure,
I'm
but
being a little
but
flip about that, but
but situations are what we're really looking for when we play.
right, it's what we do. We're certainly,
Yeah.
in my game Circle of Hands, I actually make a big deal about this, partly because the setting is full of all sorts of like dark Iron Ages awfulness. And people were like, "Are you saying that we're supposed to do that?" And I was kind of like, "Wait a minute, we have to talk, right?"
Right. Right.
And I talked about what I called backdrop, which is just like in theater. I mean, you can't touch the backdrop,
Right.
but
Yeah.
you
I
look
like
at
that
the
actually.
yeah, yeah,
I
and so you got the backdrop, and then you've got like the immediate location, which is part of the backdrop, and that's where somebody has to take responsibility and say what's going on in it. And then there's the immediate situations, which I guess you could call scenes, like the really in your face situations that characters are genuinely experiencing. And I was saying that you don't have to have, you can say there are things in the backdrop that you never see in the other categories. So
sure.
that this is dark and awful fantasy, but there are certain things we just don't want to look at or have our characters cope with. So
Yes.
we're going to leave them in the backdrop. You know, it's like
Right.
it shows up in the opening credits of the TV show, right,
Yeah.
as part of the opening montage. But we never
Right.
actually see our character like doing that or getting that done to them, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
so I guess what I'm saying is when we're talking about like making up that situation, you know, that's we got to talk about what we can legitimately draw it from.
Okay.
First of all,
Okay. Yeah.
if you've and that's why I mean I guess people really are hungering after those huge setting books because they need something to draw upon.